Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. This is Steve Handelman. I'm the director of the Center on Media Crime and Justice, and welcome to the opening program of our series on youth justice, the next frontier. We have an extraordinary group of people to speak to you today and over the next month. But before we actually begin the proceedings, I wanted to have a special shout out for the folks who have helped make this uh, work. The people who funded the program. As many of you know, this is our fourth series of workshops on youth justice. All the previous ones have been live, but now, thanks to COVID, we are going virtual. So I want to first introduce Emily Tao from the Tao Foundation, who started us off, and then I will go to our other funders and we can start. Emily, hi.
Hi. Thanks, Steve. And I just want to start by congratulating everyone at the center, John Jay, for shifting this typically in-person event to this, I know is going to be a very interactive virtual gathering, courtesy COVID-19. It's a real honor to welcome all of you to the first of these 5 interactive webinars on 2 issues that could not be more critical in the world right now, youth justice and journalism. And as Steve said, my name's Emily Tao. I'm the president of the Tao Foundation, which is a family foundation based in Connecticut. And I've been serving as the president for the last 25 years. My parents, Leonard and Claire Tao, started the Tao Foundation in 1988, and when they found themselves quite unexpectedly more fortunate than other people that they knew. And the foundation was really created to formally give back for the opportunities that they felt they had, including being able to go to Brooklyn College when it was free. And, we have incredible commitments to the CUNY system. And so we love that John Jay is part of that family and ours. And our values at the Tao Foundation are really embedded in a couple of core areas: fostering a culture of entrepreneurship and taking chances on people and populations that we think may not be necessarily popular, but have, where our support could really make a big difference. Supporting ideas and innovation around creative solutions to society's most challenging problems, encouraging and facilitating collaborative efforts to encourage a collective thinking where no one person or organization working alone could really discover the best ideas, and also offering transformational experiences. And that's with both all the way from, the medical scholars to currently and formerly incarcerated people. And our investment in opportunities for learning that are exemplified in this fellowship and conference have been also a core interest of ours. And all of you, the journalists and editors who are covering youth justice, are really our way of communicating to the public that the issues that are going on with young people and how they could possibly help them to support positive change. And we really feel like this particular fellowship has been given access to journalists who are hungry to share stories of young people and their experiences in the justice system, and the data and information to back stories about both bad things that are happening and also the solutions to how we can do better. And that has been an important part of our strategy. And we are so grateful for all the journalists who have participated over the years and written such important and influential stories, educating the public in all the communities where they come from. So I couldn't be more happy to be participating today and listening in, and we're going to be following all the stories that you guys are writing or sharing on whatever platform. And I'm going to turn it back to Steve.
Thank you, Emily. I might add that in the first 3 series that we ran when we were live, we've had about 250 stories that have been produced as a result of these workshops, some of them, in fact, prize-winning. So thank you, Emily. I want to move the floor, give the floor to Carol Abrams, who is the Senior Communications Associate for the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. The program today will let you hear from a number of Casey experts. And what I'm hoping to do in this welcome is just let you put a face to the name. I work in the communications area of the Casey Foundation. So when you reach out to media@aecf.org for a more national perspective of what's happening in youth justice, you'll actually be reaching me. So please keep that in mind, that we're here to help. And I look forward to you having an hour with Nate Balis, who heads the Foundation's juvenile justice work, in just a few minutes. Thanks, everyone, and back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Carol. And last but definitely not least, Galit Lipa, who is the Program Director at the Public Welfare Foundation.
Hi, all. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Galit. I'm a Program Director of Public Welfare Foundation. We are a national foundation based in Washington, D.C., committed to transformative change in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. And at the foundation, we recognize that there has been significant change in the juvenile justice systems over the years. But in most parts of the country, the juvenile justice system remains a subset of the criminal justice system, based largely on punishment, banishment, and shame, things that we know don't work. But that won't change, and we won't have movement until people's thinking shifts from sort of notions of law and order to more nuanced understanding of what real safety and accountability look like. And that is why the work you all do of storytelling and reporting and public education is so, so important. So on behalf of Public Welfare Foundation, I just want to thank you for being here, for being committed to learning, for the important work you do, and I'm looking forward to joining and learning as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Galit. Actually, that's a great segue, because in our previous sessions we've had on juvenile justice and youth justice, which we're describing it as now, one of the last themes was juvenile justice unfinished business. And this year we're looking at the next frontier. So there's so much going on, it's almost impossible to just catalog everything. And even in the next 5 sessions over through November, we're probably not going to catch every single topic. But it's clear that youth justice is at a crossroads, and probably the best way to start looking at it as an overview is to bring on Nate Balis, who is at the Annie Casey Foundation. He's director of the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group, and with him, we're going to have a discussion with Joe Domanick, our journalism coordinator. And before I bring Nate on, I'd just like to point out that our agenda is on our conference webpage. It is changing as we go. The latest iteration is now available on our page. Emily will put the link on. You can also see bios of all of our speakers for today and tomorrow. And I recommend that you keep checking in at that webpage, at the conference page, because we'll have more information. We'll be putting on material and research that comes out of the different sessions, and obviously stories that are coming out over the next 4 or 5 weeks. So, things are moving, the goalposts are changing, and one of the interesting things about a webinar series is that we can catch it as it happens, because it's not just a 2-day event as we had before. So let me bring up Nate, and Nate will speak for about 20, 30 minutes. I'll have a discussion with Joe with a few questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the rest of you. Nate, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Nate. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right.
Good. I'm really delighted that that you're with us, and I'm delighted that I'll be questioning you afterward. Then we'll have the fellows, our journalists, questioning you as well. Nate is going to speak today about hard questions for youth justice during the pandemic. What do reporters need to know to hold youth justice systems accountable? And this is going to be extremely useful, because Nate is going to do an overview, and then there are going to be lots of questions, and it's really directed at you, the reporters. So Nate, please get started, please.
Sure. So so first of all, it's great to do this, and it's a privilege to follow Emily and Galit, who are such leaders in this field as well. And I just think, as reporters covering this area in particular, it is just so easy for people to ignore the plight of young people who are in the juvenile justice system and really sort of cast them aside and not be concerned. And I just think we rely on the media. We rely on the ability to be able to tell the stories, to talk about the data, to pressure those who are in power, whether it's at the legislative level or whether it's governors or whether it's system leaders. So I just think this is a huge role. I'm thrilled to be able to talk about this. If it makes sense with you, I think I want to start by what I think is at the crux of what's different right now when we're talking about this theme of the week. And to me, that's really about race, and that I think too often when we talk about reporting, we ignore the thing that's quite literally staring us in the face about the juvenile justice system. The local data, national data, state data, they all paint the same picture that tell us that youth of color, particularly Black youth, are far more likely to be in the juvenile justice system, are more likely to be incarcerated in the system. And that data, I think, when I think about from the reporting on this, really is reflected in what we see. I worked in the system in Washington, D.C. My 5 years there, we had fewer than a handful of white kids who were ever locked up in the old Oak Hill Youth Center. When I started working at the Casey Foundation, I worked in Alabama, and we knew that about a third of the kids who were committed to state custody were white. But when we went and did our tour of the facilities in Alabama and went to the most secure facility for boys, one of my colleagues had to ask, now, where do you keep the white kids? Because we just didn't see them. When we had a delegation from Morocco, who might as well have been from another planet, coming into the Casey Foundation after having visited Baltimore's Youth Detention Center, and they only had one question that they wanted to ask us. Why were all the faces of the kids brown? That was the question they wanted to know. So this is it. This is the whole game in some ways, is that if we try to talk about justice and the youth justice system without talking about race, then we're missing the whole thing. That the experiences of young people with everything from police to the system as a whole are vastly different depending on where they live and what they look like. And to me, it is one of the places where we need to be able to consistently report in a way that reflects that reality, that all young people get in trouble, in the sense that all young people do things that bother their parents. All young people push the boundaries of authority. That's what it means to be an adolescent. And yet some kids get arrested and some kids don't. And there are so many ways that we sort of push kids into a justice system that they don't need to be involved with. And we push them deeper into the system. And the deeper we get, the more that we're likely to see youth of color rather than white kids in the system. So I'm going to start there and go back to you, Joe.
Okay, well, so why race and why now? This is nothing new. As you said, when you were in DC, these people are coming in and they're saying they're all Black faces. What's going on here? So why race and why now?
Yeah, so it's a good question, because I think in some ways you could say people who are running our systems have been aware of this for a long time. Like, this isn't something that's new, and people have been expected to track data for a long time. And yet, so we say we've known about this. But what I would say is being aware of disparities and actually addressing them are two very different things. And from my experience, there aren't nearly enough system leaders and policymakers that are even curious enough to really even understand the reasons behind the numbers, let alone take meaningful action in order to address them. They might be able to tell you overall the percentage of kids who are locked up who are white versus black versus Latino, but they can't tell you about all the different decision points in the system. They can't tell you how that differs from the population in the community. They can't tell you what that looks like at the point of arrest, point of diversion, the point on probation, how the experience differs for young people on probation, depending on where they live and depending on what they look like. I mean, these are things that, like, my experience is there's not even always really a curiosity to understand that, let alone action that's taken. I think on top of that, focusing on equity, requires that we focus on families, and requires that we actually listen to young people, listen to their families. I'm glad that this session, like this conference, is going to include a lot of focus on that, because if we are not listening to what young people say they need, then we're not really going to address equity in the juvenile justice system.
Let's go to the question of why all the faces that they were seeing were black and brown, other than the systemic racism that permeates our society and our criminal justice system. I think that there are complex reasons why this is so. Beyond that, and could you talk a little bit about that, please, Nick?
Sure. I mean, I think we could talk about it up and down. I mean, I think there are, in every state you see vastly, overrepresented youth of color in the system. And I think it starts at where I started before, which is, how do people experience the very front end of the system? And I say that with quotes because I can talk about my experience as a teenager in all the way that my friends and I pushed the boundaries of what was just bad behavior and illegal behavior. And none of us ever got arrested for it. We saw the police sometimes, but we didn't get thrown in a cop car. We were in places with underage drinking, with alcohol, with drugs, with fights, with theft, with all of that stuff, and it didn't result in being brought into the system. And it's obvious that the experience that young people have with police just from the outset is everything we're seeing this year is telling us that young people experience this vastly differently depending on where they're from. The schools are a huge point of this, and something that we understand. It's fascinating to see conversations that have gotten into looking at breaking contracts with police, of having school resource officers there, where we know that young people are experiencing this differently. Then I think we get to a point that it's possible that certain offenses that we have young people who are arrested are just more likely to be youth of color, depending on the place. It may be that more serious offenses in a place like where I am in Baltimore, that there might be more likely to be black youth who are arrested for committing a serious offense with a gun, and that might impact the population. But that doesn't explain what we see when we look at the data, which show us that most kids who are locked up aren't there for those serious reasons. They're not in custody for that. And if we were talking about a juvenile justice system that only looked like that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We're in a place where that's not what it means to look at our detained and incarcerated population in the country.
Mm-hmm. Over-policing in communities, in impoverished communities of color, and wars on drugs and crimes aimed specifically at those communities has a lot to do with it, too, yeah. I think. Yeah. And sure. So my question is, I'm working right now about solutions to policing, reimagining policing. And one of the conclusions that I'm coming to is that you can't really reform the police and transform the police unless you have community building, unless you have investments in these communities that are long-term investments. Does that jive with your experience?
Sure. I think that's a big part of it. And I think when it comes to young people, I think so much of what we need to be doing is investing in opportunities for them. It can't be about how we're responding at the point of arrest. There's obviously much bigger issues at play.
Okay, so if you could tell the reporters here, how can they start to hold the youth justice systems, all of the systems and all the components of it, more accountable? What are the metrics that they should be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it to me is just about, I always start with, and this, you know, you might hear differently from people, but I start with data. To me, it's like data. Like, help me understand what's actually happening. Can they tell you about school-based arrests? Can they tell you about diversion rates and how they're different by race? Can they talk about probation violations? We've talked, so many people want to tell us the young people who are incarcerated are there for these serious offenses. And then you look at the data underneath and you see the number of young people who are being locked up for probation violations. Can they tell you about what they're even trying to do? What's the purpose of probation? How do they see the purpose of out-of-home placement and what they're trying to do? In the pandemic, I think right now would be, you know, we have this discrete period of time. Can they tell you what's gone on with their population of kids who are in custody during that time and how it's differed by race? Can they tell us not only about the number of young people coming in the door, but about how quickly they're released? Something that we might get into about some of the work we've done this year that has shown how different that is in real time, about how kids are experiencing that differently. But I think it's more than that. I think what I'd want to know also is, who are they listening to? You know, when they talk about all the stuff they're wanting to do in the system, like, are they talking to the young people who are in the system? Are they asking them what they need? Are there processes for working with young people on probation rooted in case planning that actually connects with what a young person himself thinks they need and what they can do, and what their parents think that they need and what they can do? Like, all of that is stuff that I want to know as well. And to not be just focused on like the individual cases when there's the crisis, but what are we trying to do to help young people who are connected to the system?
So what does your experience tell you about why the people who are involved in running the system aren't asking themselves these very questions? Or are they?
I think it depends. I mean, I think we experience lots of really great system leaders who are thinking about those things, who are thinking about the big picture, who are looking at all that. I think that the familiarity with data is something that is a real weakness, of being able to look underneath and understand like what is really driving what's happening in the system. I think vision is a real issue, and vision that's informed by what the people who are impacted by the system is something that we really don't see as much, and it is something that needs to change, you know, throughout the country based on what I see. I think if we want to understand what makes a young person successful, if we want to understand what does it mean for juvenile justice to be successful, there ought to be a vision for what it is we're even trying to do and what we expect for the young people we're interacting with.
And what are some of the solutions that you think? This has been such an incredibly hectic, tumultuous year for every system in the country, and I'm sure it's been that way for youth justice as well. So, what do you think are some of the opportunities coming out of the pandemic for reforming and transforming criminal justice, juvenile justice even further? What are some of the solutions coming out that you can tell the reporters about?
So first thing I think that specific to the deterrent situation that to me, I think is meaningful based on what we've seen, is we're just such a risk averse country when it comes to this. And we've set up a system where I think in part because of the media and how it's portrayed and what happens when there's crime, that the risk of releasing a young person who then might do something bad seems to far outweigh in the minds of the people leading the system the risk of locking a kid up and all the damage we know that does. And I think for I don't want to speak for other people, but as someone who's worked in this field for 20 years, the way that those two things are weighed has always felt so out of whack from what we know. The likelihood that any young person who's coming to the door of the system is going to go back and do something awful in the community is tiny, like tiny from what we know. The odds, though, that being locked up and being removed from school, and being removed from their family and being removed from opportunities and all that stuff and being raised in an institution, like the odds that is going to do damage are so much higher. So I say that because I think one thing that the pandemic has done right now so far, at least I'm hopeful, but I think we at least have some data and some anecdotes that tell us this, which is that it sort of flipped this risk a bit at the front of the system, which is that a young person is presenting to the front door of detention. They've been arrested. Their home environment might concern people. There might be conflict. No one says that they can come and pick them up. The system has done some sort of screening tool that has this kid up. Maybe we could lock him up. If we lock him up, we know that the judge would probably release him the next day. But the safest thing to do right now is to hold him. Like, that way of thinking happens all the time. And I think the pandemic has changed that. I think the pandemic has created, like, that kid is himself a risk. He poses a risk to the other kids who are in the facility and to staff because he's coming from the outside and he could be infected. Or they don't want to expose this kid to what he might have coming into the facility. And I think we know of systems that are just taking an extra step to say, what would it take to keep this kid at home? Instead of looking for the reason why it's okay to hold him. And I think that if that spirit comes out of this and those stories behind that, like that kind of thinking, I think are critical right now to cover in the system right now. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Nick, talk to these reporters about the incredible damage they do in terms of transforming the system by not including and understanding the context of what they write when they're just saying 16-year-old kid, a judge releases him, he goes out and commits another violent crime. We see those stories all the time. How does that impact the youth justice system?
I mean, I think it obviously has a big impact. Like no one wants to be the leader who let the kid out who then did something that's awful. And yet again, like there are most young people coming to the front of the system who they're saying, what should we do with this kid? They're not presenting with a history that tells them that's likely to happen. I know we might talk about things like risk assessment and things like that go on, but I think that the odds that a young person is going to do something that's really violent or really damaging, there are young people who that might be the case for, but we're talking about lots and lots of kids being held who don't pose that danger. And even while we're talking about they go back to the community and they commit a new crime, the new thing that might happen isn't anything that should scare us. Like, we might not be happy that it happens, but it's not something that, like, when you weigh it against what it means to lock a kid up and the long-term impact that might have on future incarceration and the rest of it, like we need to be able to do that for young people. And we recognize that's why we have a juvenile justice system, is because we recognize that.
Well, what are the most meaningful trend lines for reporters to look at in youth justice?
I mean, I think it's important to understand, data over the long term, like of what's happened in this with juvenile crime and juvenile incarceration. And again, like the holding people accountable part, I think this is a big one. Like one thing that we'll see is, I mean, I always think of this as like a president and the economy. It's sort of like, if you've been a youth justice leader in the last 10 years, it's really easy to have reduced your incarceration rate, like the number of kids who've been locked up. Like juvenile crime's gone down for 25 years. And like, so it would be hard to not reduce incarceration over that span, given what's happened. That's why we see over 50% drop in the number of young people in custody over the last 20 plus years. But what they don't do often, and what we rarely see happen then when we're talking about reporting on this is, so how do those two things compare? How does incarceration compare to arrests? So in other words, if our arrests are down by 50% and our incarceration rate is down by 25%, like on its own, the 25% reduction in incarceration might look like something that we can like pat ourselves in the back for. But you've actually increased the likelihood during that time that a kid who's been arrested is going to be locked up. And that, I think, is something that people miss all the time. Like, and being able to actually talk about that is really important. Being specific about who is locked up, I think, is just really critical. Like this same thing happens. We hear all the time. You hear, and I see it reported all the time, where we see, well, the population's been down by so much, so the kids we have today are just way more serious than what we had going back 20 years. But show me the data that like actually tell me that that's what's going on. Because what I just said, again, if arrests are down by 50% and incarceration is down by 50%, that wouldn't suggest to me that the kids who are locked up today are any more serious than they would be otherwise. So it's like that kind of thing that we need to be able to do. I think the other thing is the kind of things that people want to talk about when it comes to out-of-home placement is there's a lot of focus on, there's a lot of semantics. You know, here are the kids we have in our youth correctional facilities, our detention centers, but then they don't tell you about all the other kids who are being removed from their homes and being sent to other out-of-home placements, sometimes in a completely different state, right? That they don't call prison or detention, but nevertheless are young people whose liberty is being taken away and they're being put in places with very little accountability and no eyes on what's going on in those places. So I think all of that stuff is worth focusing on. I mean, that's just a couple things, but there's so many, but I mean, I would start there for sure. And all of that, again, just not to keep beating the same thing here, but like we need to break that down by race and gender all the time, or else we will miss what's happening.
I know that there are many, many different systems and many, many levels of progressive reform and resistance. But what do you think? What are the metrics that reporters, when they're looking at their local systems, should use to judge whether these systems are doing what? What is the ultimate goal? What should that be? And are systems really do they have this kind of reasonable goal? What do you think the reasonable goal and the essential goal should be?
I mean, so I think this is in some ways an easy question, in some ways is a hard question. Like I think yes, like just to name the things that we care about, because they're right there in the juvenile justice concept, that young people, we need to care about public safety and we need to care about youth rehabilitation. I mean, those are things that whether you are a community-based organization, a social worker, or a guy who runs some like awful boot camp, they will tell you that they're about community safety and about rehabilitation. I think I'd add on top of that we should care about victims, and we should make sure that victims, especially if they've been harmed, that we have a system that focuses on repairing that harm as well. I think all those things are true. I think the important thing, though, is that the way we get to community safety is through caring about the well-being of young people and focusing on that. If we start from an idea that community safety comes from incarceration, then we sort of miss we miss it. Like, we miss like what actually works and what doesn't work. Everything we know tells us that locking kids up doesn't work, and like working with young people in the community with effective interventions is much more effective and much more likely to reduce the likelihood of them coming back into the system. So I guess my point is, we should care about that. We should care about those things. I'd like to care about more than that, right? Like, there's no young person. Like, I used to work with, he probably is going to speak in this conference, but I worked under a director who used to come in and say, the bar we set for young people in the system is one that we would never set for someone who we care about. I never have my daughter come home from school at the end of the day and say, I'm so glad you didn't use drugs today. I'm so glad you didn't skip school today. I'm so glad you didn't get pregnant today. Like, we would never do that for somebody who we care about, who we have bigger aspirations for. For kids in the system, we fail to do that all the time. We don't even ask them what it is that they're wanting to do. We don't even get underneath, like, what are they thinking? I would love to see the stories right now at this moment about young people in this moment in history who are in the system and what they're thinking about their future and about the future of our country. I was talking today to one of my colleagues who has twin 17-year-old boys, and black boys who are turning 18 this weekend. And so they voted yesterday for the first time. And he was describing that moment of what that felt like for him and for them. And I just think that gets so lost. We don't think of the young people in the system. We give ourselves an excuse to not think of them as these full people. And instead we think of them as these, like, did they reoffend and did they do all that? And we obviously want more. I think the challenge is we don't want kids stuck in a system in order to achieve these other results, but we need to be listening to them about what it is that they are hoping to achieve and what they want.
I want to remind all of our reporters that we want your questions, please. Just put them on, just put them up, and I will be asking those questions, or we'll have somebody ask those questions to Nate. Nate, let's talk a little bit about recidivism.
Sure.
Recidivism rates are high in criminal justice, in our criminal justice system in general. So talk a little bit about that. What are the pitfalls that to watch out for when our reporters report about recidivism? This guy he's been arrested 5 times. Let him stay in jail for a while. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I think recidivism is important, and I think this is one of those areas where I have like a major pet peeve of how it's reported. So, like, just to put it out there, because I think recidivism, we say it like it means something, like that the word means something, and yet of course it can mean like a million things, and each system is reporting recidivism in vastly different ways. And it can mean, and we might want to know something different depending on what's going on. So let me unpack that a little bit of what we want to talk about. So let's be specific. Like, one of the things I think in reporting this is be specific. Like, what do we care about when it comes to recidivism? So for example, we have a young person who's come to the system and they are there for a gun offense. And now they're in the community and they get rearrested, but they get rearrested for marijuana possession. Most places are going to track that as recidivism. But why do we care about that? Like, what's the reason if the thing that we're addressing is the behavior about a kid carrying a gun? If he's not carrying a gun right now, like, that might be the biggest success that we have. Like, that's the behavior that we're trying to change. This other thing, we might not think it's good, but it's certainly not the thing that would be like, that's our concern. So for the most part, when people are tracking recidivism, they're tracking just this like bare thing of, were they arrested? Or sometimes they're saying, were they adjudicated? Sometimes they're saying, were they recommitted to the system? I think there's another thing, though, that's really important with this, which is, again, if we're talking about recidivism because what we're worrying about is the system put all these kids back in the community, and was that a safe thing to do? So I want to know the recidivism rates for the kids now that they've been put back in the community. Well, again, I would say, don't just look at whether they've been rearrested, but what were they rearrested for? Like, was it something that would suggest they shouldn't be in the community? Or was it just another arrest that, not that it shouldn't be addressed, but it doesn't need to be addressed through something as extreme as incarceration? But the other thing, though, that I think happened is probation, the major experience that most young people have in the system, far more likely than other outcomes for a kid. If I go to court and all I've been doing is getting in trouble, I'm getting in trouble in school, I'm not going to school. I'm getting in trouble with my parents, I'm not making curfew. I'm using drugs and I'm not supposed to be using drugs. And now I've been getting arrested too, and I'm not supposed to be getting arrested. And a judge writes this order that says I'm on probation, and now I get put in the community. Well, measuring whether or not I got rearrested in the first 2 weeks of being on probation, what are we measuring exactly? Like, it's not like just because the judge signed the order, I magically am going to stop this behavior that I've been doing for months leading up to the point of being put on probation.
Right.
We should be measuring the effectiveness on probation of, after we gave the kid the experience, did their behavior change? So I think it's just one of these things where I just feel like we have to be willing to get into the weeds. And one other thing about this that I think is just, it's a language thing more than anything that I think is really important on this. And I get more animated than I should maybe, but about this issue, which is we use recidivism as a synonym for reoffending. We do not have any data that tells us reoffending. It doesn't exist. We don't know reoffending. We know proxies for reoffending, like rearrest, reconviction, all that kind of stuff. Again, kids are doing stuff all the time in the community that could get them rearrested, and they don't get arrested. Yeah. So offending is something different than being arrested. And so that language is something that we need to be careful with, especially since they can be arrested and also not having done anything. They can be arrested also. So I think we just need to be careful there.
And change is a process. It's not black
change
and white,
is a process,
and it's not all overnight.
Right.
Which brings me to the brain development in adolescence and what that has taught the youth justice community over the last 10, 15 years. Can you talk about that a little bit, please, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, so what do we know? You know, like, this is an area that's really important to understand. And what do we know? We know adolescence is unique. You know, we know this is this new period of growth that young people have, and the brain is doing a million things, and it's tied to puberty and everything else going on. We know that it helps explain why young people in high school can do calculus, even though all of us who are probably on this call can't do calculus anymore. And they can do things that make us go, how could you have done that? How could you have done something that was so stupid or so impulsive or whatever? It's like, that's adolescence. That is the chemistry of adolescence. So it also tells us really important things about what works and matters to young people, like this stuff. So incentives matter more than sanctions. This is huge because we have a system that is set up entirely rooted in sanctions. We'll give a probation order that says you have to do these things, and if you don't follow the rules, you can get sent back to detention or you can get more conditions put on you. And yet we know that teenagers are more likely to respond to incentives to good behavior, even if the incentive is just the attaboy on the back, let alone financial incentives, like getting off probation earlier, like things that are incentivize their behavior. So we need to be willing to swallow our pride and think about what works. I think there's another thing that gets under thought of in this adolescent brain research that I would love to imagine a whole bunch of stories on, which is about fairness. Picture being a teenager or knowing a teenager or having a teenager, and it's like the number one thing will be, that's not fair. That's not fair. Like, fairness matters to all of us, but fairness matters like exponentially more to teenagers. And if teenagers are aware of the system, if we look at all the protests that happened over this summer, teenagers are aware of the lack of fairness, the lack of equity in the system. And the idea that on its face, the juvenile justice system may be seen as unfair reduces the likelihood that youth will be bought into anything they're being asked to do. So think about that in terms of what we're talking about. Like the brain research tells us, it's not, we can't just ask kids to do things. They're going to have to be bought into that. So all that matters. The thing though, I want to say though, is like, I don't know how much the system is really following this stuff. I think people like to talk about the adolescent brain research much more than they want to apply it. I don't think it's informing the interactions that police officers have with young people in the community. I don't think it's informing the way that our courts are set up and the interactions between judicial officers and young people and their families. I don't think it impacts the duration of young people on probation. It doesn't, this stuff hasn't been used to impact the things that are happening. And I think it especially doesn't matter. And I know I'm glad that there's going to be focus in the conference on this, but the way in which we treat young people who commit the most serious offenses, we have just like universally decided we get to throw all that brain research out the window, all the stuff about what works out the window. And now we're going to do things like treat them like adults, even though the core thing about adolescents is they're not adults. They're not adults. They're children who are going through adolescence. And so instead, we end up trying kids in adult courts, or we send them to youth correction facilities that aren't based on any of that adolescent research. So I just think we've given ourselves a pass on this. It's like, on the one hand, there's all this amazing information, and it's incredible that we have this information, yet it's applied unevenly. It's applied differently depending on who the kids are. And it's, you know, and I think that's just continues to plague us.
I'd like to ask my fellow journalists if they have any questions. I'm not seeing any questions up here yet, so I'll just continue with Nate. But please join us.
Joe, there are. This is Steve. There are a bunch of questions on the chat line. I wonder if Emily could start reading them.
Okay, that would be great.
Yeah,
Emily,
14,
please.
So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can go ahead and get started. So our first question that we have here is from Eddie Burkhalter. His question says that he covers adult prisons in Alabama and the racial disparity is clear there. For Mr. Balis, in your work in the state previously, do you see clear connections between racial makeup of those in juvenile detention centers and adults in state prisons? I can't, I mean, it's a great question. I don't know enough about it. I wouldn't be surprised. Like, in terms of, one of the things that we know is youth incarceration is one of the biggest predictors of whether a young person will end up in the adult criminal justice system. I think the same mechanisms that create disparities for young people up until they're 18 create disparities when they're over 18. So I would not be surprised. I think I'm also knowing what the juvenile facilities look like in Alabama and reading about the prisons, I would definitely see a connection between those two things as well.
Okay, next question, please.
Yes, our next question is from C. Corley. She says that if young people who are incarcerated are not there for serious crimes, what are they there for? She said maybe status offenses, and are there places that are changing how they approach or use status offenses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one, you know, I always find when I give interviews with people writing stories, I'm always like both trying to quote data and say, go to this source of data to look at information. And there really is great national data that's out there. And in addition to oftentimes states that include all of their information on their website, some are easier to find than others. But when we look at, like, for example, you can look nationally, the Census of Juveniles in Residential Placement is a great resource. There's another one that's on court statistics, and you can look back over decades to look at what's happened with young people coming into court, which allows you to see the trends on both who's coming in the door and then what happens as an outcome. But when we look at, like, the Census of Juveniles in Residential Placement, we see consistently that there are lots of young people who get detained and committed for probation violations, that we see lots of young people who are getting detained and committed for misdemeanors, whether those are things like simple assault or whether they're theft. A lot of young people getting committed on felonies, but that are theft related, that are auto theft or burglary or something like that, but not the most violent offenses. So we see that range. And I don't want to suggest again that there are no young people with serious offenses who are locked up. But if we look at the national picture, I think and the state picture, I know I've seen the Maryland data. It's just not what we would think as citizens of the state that we live in, that this is why kids are getting locked up when you look at the data.
Great.
We have, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say thank you. I wanted to move on to another question, if that's okay, unless, Joe, you wanted to say something else.
Yes, please.
Okay.
No, go right ahead.
Okay. So we have a question from Eileen Weissman, and she was saying she really liked what was being said about having low expectations for the system, kids compared to other kids. She would like to hear more about how journals can help change the narrative around these kids through the language and the terminology they use to talk about the issues and describe them.
Great question.
Yeah, I think that's really big. I mean, again, some of it is of things to avoid, of like just language to avoid. And I know this is really hard because we do it all the time and we catch ourselves doing it, even speaking from an advocacy role. But for example, like the word offender is just, it's used all the time. And we hear people in the systems use it all the time. I've certainly used it myself, like in the past, and it's like been a thing to teach myself to get away from. I'm always reminded of the Brian Stevenson quote of each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And I think about that idea of like a 15-year-old or 16-year-old who's gotten arrested for something, and then we call them an offender. I mean, it's just, these kids are so much more than that. And I think that's the lesson. It's like, they're so much more than this offense. And they'll all tell you, like, I know there's going to be some like youth panel, like that's one of the biggest message. Don't think of me because of the thing. Like, I'm a full person with stuff going on, with feelings and things in my life and all that. Don't just call me the offense and what that is. So I think that's one of them. Other things that are like that, like high risk. So risk gets used a lot. And they'll say things like sort of a high risk youth. Well, that's not a thing, right? It's not like a kid with diabetes. That's not what that means, right? It's not a diagnosis. It's someone used a tool and a kid scored in some range that was determined that they were high. And that might be meaningful information, but it's never a label that we should assign to the young person themselves. And so we have to just be careful with doing that. I think the kind of adultification of young people because of the behavior is something that like we really need to watch out with. And that is, again, especially happens for youth of color, and we need to be able to like watch that. So I guess those are the things that are just, they stick out as things to avoid, like as we talk about young people. It's like, I know it's so hard, but it's anything we can do that gets at the complexity of this and of the young people involved, and that treats them as whole people. And I know that can be really difficult, but I think that's a big one for me.
Okay, we're running out of time, and I just want to talk a little bit, Nate, about the pandemic. And I ask you, what could the youth justice system look like post-pandemic? Is anything good coming out of this situation in terms of the transformation of the youth justice system?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, one of the things is where I kind of went before, which is just to say, like, there's been a lot of good stories about kids getting infected in the facilities and about the risk of incarceration for adults and young people. The Sentencing Project has done like a great job of just tracking through media stories and through public websites of just like what's going on, and seeing like just the number of young people who are locked up, who are being exposed to COVID-19, I think is just underscore what we all already know, which is that these are not environments that are safe for young people. We can't, they don't have a lot of privacy. They're pushed in a place and they don't have any freedom. They're not outside enough. Like all the things that we could say that are problematic are there. And on top of that now, we're talking about young people who are in a lot of places this whole time. They've had no visitation. They've had no in-person school. Like the things that theoretically would be therapeutic are gone. And so when we recognize that and you step back and say, what are we doing? What are we doing locking kids up? What are we even thinking we're getting out of that other than some sort of very short-term incapacitation? And we better have a really good reason to do it. And I'm saying that in that way because I feel like that attitude, I have seen more. I have seen more of that. I think that can be a good thing. I think the struggle that systems have to truly value community partners and see them as partners, like working with them, and of young people and their parents as like collectively planning on what to do to help. Like this experience has underscored just how critical it is to have everyone on board. How critical connections are for young people in the community, how critical it is to have community partners who are willing to step up and help. And so I feel like, again, that's a weakness of the system, that when we've seen examples of that working, like that's the stuff that you want to have sitting there when this is all done. I think the fear I have, and Joe, I don't know if you're going to go there, but like my concern that I have is, and it's something, again, I hope really does get reported on a lot, is the budget. That here it is, it's like, we're talking earlier about what works with young people. Relationships work, connection works, having opportunities to achieve those things work, incentives work. When the budgets squeeze, the easiest thing to cut are those community programs that are doing all that creative stuff. And the hardest thing sometimes to cut is the facilities that have fixed costs associated with locking kids up, or staff on the probation side of things. Like the juvenile justice system has an opportunity at this moment to hold on to the things that are working the best and get rid of the things that are not. Like we can't afford it. And yet I fear that that's not what will happen. I fear that without the pressure that comes from like media to be able to say, what are we getting out of this facility over here? Like, what are we getting out of these contracts where we're sending kids to residential programs and we're paying on a per diem basis to send those kids away? What are we getting out of that when we could be doing something more effective in the community?
Okay, Nate, could you address, this is from Diane, could you address the movement to raise the minimum age of juvenile jurisdiction? Some states have no minimums and others have it at age 7. Also, the efforts to raise the age higher than 18. As you know, there are three states now that are still under the age of 18, Georgia, Texas, and Wisconsin.
Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about that. And I know you're going to be talking to people who, like, this all feels like an intro. You're going to have like the true, like the real experts coming in. But I'll say there's been, the Campaign for Youth Justice, which is going to be closing its doors at the end of the year. And it's been just an unbelievable advocacy effort that has been aimed at trying to flip all of these awful laws that our country passed in the 1990s, making it easier to try kids as adults, and pushing to raise the age around the country has been like a huge effort, and they should be applauded, and everyone working towards it at the state level, local level, it's been incredible. I've been going through this right now. I'm sitting on a Juvenile Justice Reform Council in Maryland, a state like many that does not have a minimum age. So just starting there with the minimum age, we don't have one. So young people can get arrested and brought into the system at any age. It's jarring how hard it seems like it might be to get past an age like 13, which seems logical to me, but that will seem like a huge effort to go that high because no one has set it at 13 around the country. There have been some efforts that have passed it now at like 12. And every state ought to have at least a minimum age. I mean, when you look at how there are not that many young people getting arrested at those ages, but each time is such a ridiculous exercise, and one that just speaks to kind of the brutality of justice in our country, that we're treating like little kids in a system when they'd be better worked with it somewhere else. I think in terms of raising the age, we're obviously very close to having all states at 18. I'm really intrigued by the efforts to go higher. I mean, and to be able to push the age much higher than that. And we see variations of that already in the facilities. You don't have to go too far, like New Jersey, where young people who are tried as adults can be held well into their like mid-20s. Same with Oregon, same with other places. So there are young people who were arrested as kids, tried as adults, who then stay well into their 20s in juvenile facilities. So we see that happening as well. So I think this is to me, this, like I said before, the way that we so cavalierly take kids who are still teenagers and under the age of 18, and we try them in adult courts because of the offense, is really, there's been so much progress, but it continues to be a practice that all the evidence tells us it's more likely to lead to future offending as opposed to helping a kid in any way. So it's not really helping public safety or otherwise. I think if we look at like the campaign for the fair sentencing of youth and their amazing stuff that advocacy they've done on juvenile life without parole and on extreme sentences, and you look at all these people returning home after decades of being locked up for things they did as teenagers, you see the absurdity of that act and why we could do so much better than that.
Okay, we'll be having an entire discussion of this later in the series. We have a question from David Dudley. What are some tactics that we use to get into juvenile detention facilities to speak with young people? What tactics can you suggest? David says he's run into a lot of resistance where this is concerned. So go ahead, please, Nate.
That's a good question. And I don't know if I have the best advice. I feel like at each local place, going through, for example, the Office of the Public Defender or legal aid, to be able to talk to them about what their advice is, I think would probably be the best thing to be able to talk. And, something like juvenile detention, young people are cycling in and out of those facilities. And so a young person who's there today might not be there tomorrow. And there could be young people in the community who had just been in that experience. So I don't know that we need to rely just on the people who are sitting there today. That access can probably be more difficult. But that's where I guess I would start. But that might not be exhaustive guidance. I know that others would weigh in, and you might want to ask that again as well.
Okay, here's a question for you, Nate. You can knock out of the ballpark. It's from Emily. Where should you look to find the kind of data that you're referring to, i.e. arrests, incarceration by race, gender, area?
Again, it depends if we're talking about this at a state level or are we talking about it nationally and so forth. Like, I think depending on the state, they may have data on their website that shares a lot. Like, you can look at a place like Florida and they put tons of stuff out there. Maryland, where I live, puts this massive data book annually up that allows you to look at things and split it a million different ways, although it's in PDF format, so it's not that helpful because you'd want to be able to analyze it. The national stuff on the court statistics, and you can just Google that. I can't remember what it's called. National court. If you Googled National Juvenile Court Statistics, you'd find the site. And like I said, the census of juveniles and residential placement, all that stuff is out there. But sometimes we have to ask. I know we ask for data all the time from the places we work with because they don't have it publicly, and we get it because we ask for it.
Okay, we have
Joe, we have another 10 minutes or so, and we have a lot of questions on deck. I wonder if maybe Emily could group together one or two, and the others we can just give to Nate afterwards, and he can answer, and we can send them back.
Okay.
I want to try, maybe.
I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, great. Like Stephen said, I'll try to group together a couple questions. We have a question asking if you have any suggestions on how to handle state laws and department policies surrounding privacy matters for youth in the justice system. And then as you talk about that, if you could point out if you have any specific jurisdictions in mind that have a decent model for juvenile justice that you would like to commend them for and what makes them different.
So I wish I could give advice on the first part, and I honestly don't know. I don't know the answer to that about the privacy laws and about other than the FOIA requests for records and stuff like that. But in terms of when it comes to individual kids and what we can say, I know it's frustrating. Having worked in the system, it's frustrating to feel like things get written and you can't talk about the cases that are going on. So I've seen it from that side. So I don't know. I think in terms of systems that are doing things well, I think there are a lot of systems that are doing good things. Like they're doing good things, they're doing progressive things, they're doing things that make a lot of sense. The issue is it's always happening oftentimes in pieces. They're doing one thing well and something else. I think there's been a lot written about New York, where you are, about how they've had a system that kept almost all kids out of state custody and built a local continuum of services that's been a much more effective way of doing things and keeps almost all kids at home. But that's not the only kind of places. We work pretty closely in Pierce County, Washington, that's created a new model for probation that's focused on incentives as opposed to on sanctions. That's building lots of connections with community organizations. That's been really effective. I mean, to be honest, there are lots of places that are doing good things, and there are too many to sort of enumerate right now. And there's been lots of places that have had huge reductions in their use of incarceration. I think some of it is just being able to look in whatever state you're working in to see who's doing things that really are good, because there's a lot of good stuff out there. Not enough, but a lot of good stuff.
Great. Another question we have is, why is race a more significant proxy than class in understanding youth incarceration?
So I think that's a great question. I'm glad it's there, because I feel like sometimes that's out there and not asked. So first of all, I say we don't have data on class, so it's like we can't look at it in the same way. But I think again, everything we're seeing with statistics tells us that race matters a lot, and it matters even in the same places, within the same counties. If we look and at young people who are similarly situated, that race makes a difference in terms of how they are treated by the system. We see it in every single state, every single place. Oftentimes places like race and class can easily be intertwined. And so it's not that those things, that it doesn't matter, that class doesn't matter. But I think, obviously we are seeing the way that young people interact with, for example, police can be vastly different depending on race. And I think it's a good question, and one that we should, it'd be better to unpack more in any individual place. But I think it's important to understand that race does matter, and we see it not just in one place, but in every pocket of the country.
Well, I can just add something to that. Ever since the fugitive slave laws of the early 1850s, one of the jobs of almost every police department in the country is suppression of African Americans. And that is a deeply rooted tradition within our law enforcement culture. I do want to ask another question. Some of these questions are very specific, and Nate is not, you might not know, the specifics of them, but I do want to ask him, what could the youth justice system look like post-pandemic?
I mean, I think my biggest hope for it would be that I think there's sort of the content of it and the process of it. I think one that is putting way more authority into the community and not the system. That's a big part, is that it's not just the system. We divert a much lower percentage of young people from the system as other countries do. We are stuck at under 50% of the time. Everything tells us that most kids, we should just be able to serve them without any formal system involvement. And that can only happen, if we're doing it right, through community organization. So one thing is that there has to be a shift. We're seeing this in places like Los Angeles County right now, shifting vast amount of resources from system to community organizations and putting them. Secondly, like, this is the time, again, to be asking young people. They're standing up, they're protesting the system itself, asking them, what do they want? What do they need? What is it that they need to thrive, as opposed to relying simply on like the system to have the answers. So I think that's the big part. I think that the third thing I'll say is just where I went before, because I can't reiterate it enough. We are investing vast amounts of the system's resources in the things that get the worst outcomes. And that's a choice. That doesn't have to happen. And we have the ability to shift that if we choose to do it.
I think we can take 2 more questions here. Emily, you've got 2 on your plate.
I've got one right here from Micah. Have you seen any stories about any of the issues that you're concerned about that involve individual people, that you wish you could see more of those kinds of stories?
Sure. I thought, obviously this summer, that I thought the story, even though the story about Grace, the girl in Michigan that got national attention, the one who was put in detention for skipping virtual school for a probation violation. I thought that story mattered because the fact that it resonated with people because it was so absurd. And the only people it wasn't absurd to are those who follow the juvenile justice system, because that happens all the time. That is the essence of why probation is broken as a concept, because we put rules on kids and then we lock them up for breaking the rules. And so to me, the kind of story that can tie an individual story with a broader theme, I think is really important. My concern is when the story only is about the one example and doesn't bring it up to the broader theme of what's going on. Whether that's about an individual place, like last year's stories around Glen Mills in Pennsylvania, the big facility that people from all over the country sent their kids to, and it treats it like a one-off, as opposed to, this is a systemic failure of a coziness between systems and this type of place, and the overuse of these kinds of placements in general. Like, that needed to be part of the story. But I think the more we can tie the individual story to that. The other thing that I would wish we could have more of is the individual stories that again can talk about the kid beyond just this bad thing that's happened to them or the bad thing that they've done, and that can get at the more complex nature of them as people who are young people who are flawed and wonderful and all that. And and to be able to bring that out more, that's, I think, feels like the more elusive kind of story that we don't get to see enough.
Okay, let me paraphrase another question, which
I think
is,
we're going to have to stop it there because we're at 2:15.
Okay.
So we'll have to. We've got a whole bunch of questions still waiting to be asked, but I think what we can do is that we can group them together and we'll send them to Nate, and Nate can answer them the old-fashioned way by actually writing them out, and then we'll put them on our website. So don't hesitate. You'll keep asking your questions. And if you have any others that occur to you during the day, just send them an email to me or to Joe, and we'll make sure that Nate gets them. But Nate and
thank
Joe,
you so much. I really appreciate being able to do this, and I hope everyone has a wonderful conference.
Nate,
thank you so much.
Thank you
Nate.
so much.
So we're going to take a 5 or 6 minute break right now before we get on to our next session, which is the last one of the afternoon, of Youth Voices for Change. So stand up, relax, have a coffee, and we will be back in 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone.